The night shift nobody. That was what Dr. Gabriel had started calling her 3 weeks ago, loud enough for residents to hear, soft enough that nobody could prove he said it. Sarah Chen didn't react. She never did. Reactions were luxuries, and she'd learned long ago that luxuries got people killed. At 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in late September, Cedar Creek Medical in Denver was moving at half speed. The emergency department hummed with that particular quiet that comes when the world is sleeping and only broken things are awake. Sarah moved through the corridors with a limp that had become so familiar to her body that she'd stopped apologizing for it. The shrapnel from Tikrit had taught her that some things just stayed, and you learned to work around them. 14 years ago, a piece of Iraqi concrete had embedded itself in her left thigh bone, and the surgeons had worked 9 hours to get most of it out. The rest, they said, was too close to the femoral artery. Leave it. Let it scar over. Learn to live with the ghost of it. She had. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in that particular shade of hospital white that made skin look like something already dead. Sarah stood at the nurse's station at 2:43 a.m., reviewing charts with the kind of meticulous attention that made other nurses openly resentful. Every line of her handwriting documented exactly what she saw: timestamps, equipment serial numbers, dosages that didn't match manufacturer recommendations. She'd been charting like this for 2 decades, first in military field hospitals where precision meant someone went home to their family, and now here, where precision apparently made her a problem. The antiseptic smell mixed with floor cleaner formed a chemical haze that she'd stopped noticing years ago. Dr. Gabriel had ordered 3 unnecessary spinal fusion procedures this month. 3. Each one using devices from a supplier called Precision Orthopedic Systems, a company that happened to have Dr. Gabriel's younger brother listed as a silent partner. Sarah's pen paused over the notation. She didn't underline anything. She didn't highlight. She simply documented what she saw, because documenting was all she was permitted to do. Reporting would be stepping out of line. Reporting would be the night shift nobody forgetting her place. The elevator chimed at 3:15 a.m. Dr. Gabriel stepped onto the floor, and the air pressure changed. That was the only way to describe it, not a physical thing, not something you could measure with instruments, but real enough that Sarah's body registered it before her mind caught up. His Italian shoes clicked against linoleum like a countdown timer. He moved with the fluid confidence of a man who had spent 30 years believing that excellence and entitlement were the same thing. His eyes found Sarah at the nurse's station, and she felt them land on her the way you feel a spotlight swing across a dark stage. He approached. She didn't look up. Still working on those charts. His voice carried the particular texture of manufactured concern, the kind lawyers trained into their voices. You know, other nurses managed to complete their shift in 8 hours. Sarah's jaw clenched. Just once. Barely perceptible. She kept her eyes on the paper in front of her. My documentation is thorough, doctor. Thorough. He leaned against the counter, and she could smell his cologne, something expensive that probably cost more than her monthly car payment. That's one word for it. Another word might be obsessive. Another might be paranoid. He reached down and turned the chart toward himself, his manicured fingers tracing her handwriting. All these serial numbers. These questions about necessity. You're not a surgeon, Sarah. No, sir. You're not on the audit committee. No, sir. So why do you chart like someone who thinks she is? He turned the chart back toward her with a gesture that felt like a dismissal. Focus on patient care. Let the doctors worry about the big picture. He walked away. His shoes clicked back toward the elevator. Sarah's hands remained steady on the counter, but something in her chest had tightened into a fist. She'd been Master Chief Petty Officer Chen for 20 years. She'd made life-and-death decisions under fire in Tikrit, in Fallujah, in Sanjin Valley. She'd held the carotid arteries of dying men steady while medevac helicopters screamed overhead. And now she was being talked to like she was stupid. That was when the trauma alert came through. The intercom crackled, code red, Trauma Bay 1. ETA 2 minutes. multi-trauma motor vehicle accident, 42-year-old male, decreased level of consciousness. Sarah moved before the announcement finished. Her body knew what to do. Her hands were already moving toward the supply cart, muscle memory taking over the way it always did in the space between training and crisis. The other nurses mobilized too, but there was that fractional delay that came with emergency department work at 3 in the morning, the half-second it took to shift from autopilot to adrenaline. Sarah was already at full speed. The ambulance sirens wailed outside, getting closer. Louder. The kind of sound that meant someone's life had just changed trajectory. The trauma bay doors burst open, and the paramedics rolled in with a patient whose face was obscured by an oxygen mask, whose body was wrapped in a cervical collar, whose left side showed the kind of damage that made even experienced nurses pause. The paramedic was shouting vitals over the noise of the stretcher wheels squeaking against the tile floor. Blunt force trauma, hit a telephone pole at approximately 60 miles per hour, signs of internal bleeding, pupils dilated and sluggish, last BP was 90/54 and dropping. Sarah was already there. She moved the oxygen bag to one hand, her eyes tracking the patient's color, the rise and fall of his chest, the way his left side looked concave in a way that meant pneumothorax, meant internal bleeding, meant the clock was counting down in seconds now instead of minutes. "Get a large bore 4, she said. Not asked. Said. The resident moved. 2 units O negative to the trauma bay now. Another nurse ran. Portable X-ray. Trauma panel, trauma ultrasound. Dr. Gabriel walked in at 3:19 a.m. He took in the scene with the kind of assessment that told Sarah he understood the severity, even if he didn't understand what his next move should be. He looked at the monitor. He looked at the patient. He looked at Sarah. "I'll need the surgical team," Sarah said, and something in her voice must have sounded wrong because he looked at her harder. Intercostal space is flat on the left. No breath sounds. He's bleeding out. The resident can handle. The patient's monitor screamed. Flat-lined. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator hiss and the fluorescent lights buzz and the rain starting outside, hitting the trauma bay windows like applause. The patient's left side was barely moving. Pneumothorax. Hemothorax. Pericardial tamponade. A cascade of things that meant dead without intervention in the next 60 seconds. Sarah moved. Her hand went to the emergency kit on the wall. The combat knife was there, actually a surgical blade, but muscle memory didn't pass the distinction. She'd done this in Tikrit, in a basement under fire with nothing but a knife and hands that couldn't afford to shake. She'd done this when a Marine took shrapnel that tore through his thoracic cavity and the medevac was still 5 minutes out. She'd done this, and the Marine had walked out of the hospital for months later and called his mother. "What are you doing?" Dr. Gabriel's voice came from somewhere very far away. Sarah was already through the skin. The blade knew the exact intercostal space, second rib, lateral line, the anatomical map burned into muscle memory. She opened the thoracic cavity with movements that were efficient, precise, guided by something deeper than conscious thought. The hiss of air escaping. The dark blood that meant the lungs had collapsed into themselves. She positioned her hand, and then her fingers were inside the chest cavity, finding the heart, feeling it there like a trapped bird that had stopped beating. Her hand started moving. Compressions. Manual. Direct contact. The way they'd trained her, the way they'd trained every combat medic who'd ever worked beyond the reach of hospitals. The other nurses had frozen, but that didn't matter. Sarah's world had narrowed to the size of a heartbeat, to the feeling of the ventricles under her fingers, to the moment where everything balanced on whether muscle memory was stronger than death. 30 compressions. 60. 90. The monitor showed a tremor. Then a spike. Then, sinus rhythm. The patient's heart was beating again. His oxygen saturation climbed. 68, 72. 78, the color started returning to his lips. "Get him to OR, Sarah said, stepping back. Her voice sounded strange in her own ears, not the careful, deferential tone of a night shift nobody, but something harder. Something with command in it. 2 units blood ahead. He's going to need a thoracic surgeon and he's going to need them now. The trauma team moved. Faster now. The stretcher was rolling out of the trauma bay, and Sarah stood motionless in the center of the room, her hands covered in blood, her chest rising and falling with adrenaline that hadn't yet started to fade. Dr. Gabriel stood in the doorway. His face was very still. "Clean up," he said finally. "We'll talk about protocol violations after you're done." He left. Sarah stood alone in the trauma bay as the rain continued hammering outside, as her hands began to shake, not from fear, but from the particular kind of tremor that came when your body understood something your mind was still trying to deny. She'd just revealed herself. In saving that patient, in performing a procedure that no night shift nurse should know how to perform, she'd cracked open the careful anonymity she'd built over 3 years at Cedar Creek Medical. The challenge coin was in her locker. The one with the unmarked trident. The one from a life that was supposed to stay buried. Sarah reached for a trauma basin and began to wash the blood from her hands under water that ran hot, then cold. The rain outside sounded like applause. The water ran hot, then cold, then hot again as Sarah watched the blood spiral down the drain. Rust-colored trails dissolved into nothing. Her hands were steady. Clinical. The kind of steady that came from having held a dying 8-year-old's chest together while bullets carved divots in the concrete around her boots. She dried her hands on a paper towel and didn't look at her reflection in the mirror. That part of her life was supposed to be buried. Classified. Locked behind redacted pages and official silence. Instead, she'd just performed an emergency thoracotomy in front of 12 witnesses using a combat knife she wasn't supposed to own, let alone carry to work in a trauma bay. The rain outside sounded like applause. Thursday morning came with a staff meeting that would reshape everything. Sarah sat in the back row of the Cedar Creek Medical conference room, the only night shift nurse summoned to morning rounds, and Dr. Gabriel's eyes found her the moment she sat down. His smile was a wolf smile, the kind that doesn't involve warmth. He stood at the head of the mahogany table, his tailored Burberry suit probably costing more than Sarah's monthly rent, and his voice dropped into that careful, courteous register that meant someone was about to be dismantled in front of an audience. "Nurse Chen," he said, gesturing with his coffee cup. "Perhaps you can enlighten us about the updated protocols for post-operative anticoagulation in patients with factor V Leiden deficiency." The resident beside her stiffened. This wasn't a casual question. This was a specialty question designed for cardiothoracic fellows, not floor nurses. Sarah answered anyway, her voice steady and quiet. "The biochemistry pathway. The contraindications. The dosing calculations." "Correct. Perfectly correct." Dr. Gabriel's smile didn't shift. "Interesting," he said, pivoting immediately to subclavian artery thrombosis management, then to the latest guidelines for managing massive transfusion protocols in the OR. Each question more obscure than the last. Each one Sarah answered correctly, and each correct answer seemed to irritate him more visibly. The resident smirked. One of them, a tall guy named Patterson who'd made it a hobby to ignore Sarah's vital sign reports, actually laughed. "Our night shift nobody thinks she knows more than the surgical residents," Dr. Gabriel said, his voice carrying a laugh underneath it, the kind designed to echo through a room and reshape how people see you. The nickname landed exactly where he'd aimed it, like a slap across the face in front of 15 people. Laughter rippled through the conference room. Muffled. Deniable. But present. Sarah's jaw clenched once, the movement barely perceptible to anyone not trained to read physical stress responses. Her pen continued moving across her notepad as if he'd commented on the weather. She wrote down post-op anticoagulation and underlined it twice. Her hands remained steady. When the meeting ended 37 minutes later, Sarah walked to the staff parking garage without speaking to anyone. The elevator carried her down 2 levels to where her 2008 Camry sat under flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed like dying insects. She gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2, the way they'd taught her in defensive driving, and sat there as dawn broke over Denver's skyline. The city looked small from the parking garage. Manageable. The kind of place where nobody was supposed to know who you'd been. She'd spent 3 years building an identity as just a nurse. Anonymous. Competent. Forgotten by 7 a.m. Dr. Gabriel had just undone 18 months of that work in front of an audience. 3 days later, Sarah opened her locker at 6:47 a.m. and found the word scratched deep into the metal, "Night shift nobody." The letters were jagged, violent, deliberate. Someone had pressed hard enough that the underlying steel showed through the blue paint like exposed bone. Her uniform hung on the hanger where she'd left it, but it had been pulled down and soaked in coffee. The brown liquid pooled at the bottom of the locker, seeping into her spare shoes. Someone had placed a tampon on top of the ruined fabric. A message. A specific kind of message that required a specific kind of hatred. 2 nurses at the far end of the locker room suddenly became very interested in their phones. Sarah didn't hesitate. She pulled paper towels from the dispenser on the wall, 8 sheets, then 8 more, and began cleaning methodically. The coffee. The uniform. The shoes. She worked without anger, without tears, without the flinch that was trying to work its way up her throat. Her hands were perfectly steady as she wiped down the inside of the locker. She even scrubbed at the scratched letters, though she knew it wouldn't erase them. The locker would carry that scar forever now. So would she. She changed into her spare scrubs from her car, kept there exactly for situations like this, and reported for her 7 a.m. rounds at precisely 7 o'clock. Not 7:02. Not 6:58. 7 o'clock on the dot, because punctuality was another kind of invisibility. She moved through the unit with the same precision she'd brought to hundreds of combat scenarios, patient vitals, medication administration, a quick check on the central line infection risk in room 304. Nobody mentioned the locker. Nobody asked about the coffee smell that had followed her up from the basement. The night shift stretched forward in slow hours. At 9:47 p.m., Sarah took her break in the break room and stared at a cup of lukewarm coffee for 23 minutes without drinking it. She could have called her VA psychiatrist. Could have filed a report with HR. Could have done what most people did when they realized they were being systematically dismantled. Instead, she sat there in the fluorescent light and realized her breathing pattern had changed sometime in the last 6 hours. It had become shallow. Controlled. The kind of breathing you did when you were about to make a difficult decision. By the time dawn came again, Sarah sitting alone in her car, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, watching the city wake up without her, she understood that Dr. Gabriel wasn't finished. This was a campaign, not a coincidence. The protocol questions. The nickname. The locker. Each incident small enough to be deniable but deliberate enough that she understood the message, "You don't belong here, and I'm going to make you prove it." She'd learned this pattern before, in a different uniform, in a different country. The methodical pressure. The calculated humiliation. The way an intelligent adversary wore you down by making you choose between accepting abuse or doing something you couldn't afford to do. Except in Tikrit, she'd had backup. She'd had a team. Here at Cedar Creek Medical, she had a limp and a job she couldn't afford to lose. What happened next would test exactly which version of herself she could actually afford to be. The elevator ride came on Friday evening at 7:33 p.m., right after Sarah's shift ended. She pressed the button for the ground floor, exhausted from 12 hours of patient care and psychological warfare, ready to collapse into her car and drive home to her apartment where nobody knew who she'd been. The doors began to close. Then a hand shot out. Dr. Gabriel stepped inside, and as the doors sealed shut, he positioned himself between Sarah and the button panel. His arm was still raised, not quite blocking the doors, but blocking her exit. His body angled so that he occupied more space than he had any right to. "Let's talk about knowing your place," he said softly. His breath smelled of expensive coffee and the arrogance of someone who'd never faced a consequence in his life. "You're a night shift nurse. A limp, a GED, asking questions about my surgical decisions. Do you understand how this hospital works? Do you understand who signs your pathetic paycheck? His voice never rose. That was the worst part. It was conversational. Intimate. The kind of voice you'd use if you were telling someone the truth they desperately needed to hear. His proximity was a weapon, 6 inches from her face, close enough that she could see the capillaries in his eyes, the particulate matter caught in the hair gel that made him look like he'd just walked out of a magazine shoot. Sarah stood perfectly still. Her eyes fixed on the elevator panel. Her breathing unchanged. The part of her that still thought in combat protocols was already calculating the 3 ways she could incapacitate him in this confined space without leaving marks that would require a hospital report. Instead, she spoke quietly. "Yes, doctor," she said. The words were deferential. Submissive. Everything she'd worked for over 3 years. Everything a person had to become to survive in a place where the institutional power was stacked entirely against them. Dr. Gabriel held her there for 4 more seconds, making sure she understood that he could, and then he stepped back and let the doors close. The elevator descended to the ground floor, and Sarah rode down alone. Her reflection in the polished steel showed a tired nurse at the end of her shift. Nothing more. Nothing less. But that night, sitting in her car as dawn broke over Denver, she realized her hands were shaking for the first time since she'd pulled a child from rubble in Tikrit. Not from fear. From restraint. The trembling wasn't weakness. It was the physical manifestation of everything she was choosing not to do. The hospital corridor hummed with fluorescent buzz at 11:30 p.m. Sarah Chen stood at the nursing station, her fingers tapping the admit clipboard once, a small tell, barely visible. The night shift at Cedar Creek Medical had its rhythms, and tonight brought a name she didn't recognize, Captain Marcus Webb, admitted through the emergency department with acute abdominal trauma, flagged for high-priority military status. No details beyond that. Just a name and a room number. She moved through the hallway with the practiced silence of someone who'd learned to occupy space without announcing it. Her scrubs were navy blue tonight, still bearing the faint coffee stain from the locker incident, the one she'd cleaned as thoroughly as she could, refusing to requisition new ones. That refusal was its own kind of resistance, though nobody would ever understand why. The challenge coin in her locker weighed exactly 1.8 ounces. She'd carried it for 19 years, invisible to every person who'd never earned the right to see it. Room for 12. 3rd floor. The monitor outside showed stable vitals, which was something. She pushed the door open and saw him. 20 years dissolved in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The boy she'd pulled from the rubble on a street in Tikrit, the child whose lungs she'd filled with her own breath while rounds fired overhead, whose small hand had gripped her finger with the terrified strength of survival instinct, whose name she'd whispered like a prayer for 6 hours while waiting for extraction, was lying in a hospital bed in Denver, Colorado, with captain's bars on his imaginary shoulders and a chart that called him Marcus Webb. His eyes opened. He looked at her, and for a moment there was only confusion. Then recognition flooded his face like a breaking wave. Master Chief. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She stood in the doorway like someone had paused the world and forgotten to press play again. Her hands remained at her sides. Her breathing stayed even. This was the moment where everything changed, where the carefully constructed boundaries between who she'd been and who she'd tried to become collapsed like a structure built on sand. Master Chief Chen. His voice cracked. The boy was gone. The man remained. I thought, when I saw the name on the intake, they said Master Chief Chen was discharged, that you were. You shouldn't be here, Sarah said. Her voice came out flat, steady, completely without inflection. You should be at BAMC. Walter Reed. Anywhere but Cedar Creek Medical. I was in Denver for training. They said this hospital was closer, and when I got the abdominal pain, I didn't think. He tried to sit up and winced. I didn't know you were here. I didn't know you were working here. Tikrit, after you got me out, they medevaced me to Baghdad, and everything was classified, and I tried to find you, but the Pentagon said you'd separated, and I thought maybe you'd. You need to listen to me. Sarah stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. The isolation was complete now, this small space hermetically sealed from the rest of the hospital. I'm going to come back in 3 minutes with an attending physician. You're going to tell him that your abdominal pain has resolved. You're going to say you need to be transferred to your base hospital. You're going to do this quietly and without explanation. My pain isn't resolved. The imaging showed Marcus. His real name, the one she'd held in her chest for 2 decades, felt foreign in her mouth. Trust me. She left before he could answer. The hallway stretched out before her like a runway, fluorescent lights casting everything in a sickly yellow hue. Her jaw was clenched so tightly she could feel her molars grinding against each other. Pain was information. Pain was data. And right now, every nerve ending in her body was screaming that something catastrophic was about to unfold. Dr. Gabriel caught her at the charting station. He appeared from the shadows of the corridor like he'd been waiting, positioned at the perfect intersection of her trajectory and his own. His presence made the air pressure change, that particular quality of space that occurs when a predator identifies prey. He held Marcus's surgical schedule in his hand, 2 pages printed and bound with a paper clip. "Ah, Chen," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of manufactured concern he'd perfected over the past weeks. "I'm assigning you elsewhere during Captain Webb's procedure tomorrow. You understand why?" Sarah didn't look up from the monitor. "I don't." "Conflict of interest. You're clearly emotionally compromised by this patient. I've documented your observation notes. They're far too detailed, far too personal for someone maintaining appropriate professional boundaries." He set the surgery schedule on her desk with the precision of someone placing a crown on a chessboard. "Additionally, I'll need your access to the EHR system restricted. Any patient records you need reviewed will require my explicit authorization. Effective immediately." This was escalation. This was Dr. Gabriel moving from social humiliation, the mockery during staff meetings, the elevator confrontation, into strategic warfare. He was dismantling her ability to help Marcus. He was isolating her. He was building the perfect architecture for what came next. "Dr. Gabriel," Sarah said, finally meeting his eyes. Her voice was steady as a surgical laser. "What's the experimental device for?" For exactly 1 second, something flickered across his face. A crack in the facade. Then it sealed shut again, replaced by a patronizing smile that suggested she was a confused child asking about adult matters she couldn't possibly understand. "The device is FDA approved for selective applications. Captain Webb is an ideal candidate. We're fortunate to have access to it here at Cedar Creek. Most hospitals have a 6-month waiting list." He adjusted his tie, a Hermes silk number in charcoal gray that cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. "You're thinking about this the wrong way. This is good for the patient. It's good for the hospital. It's good for everyone involved. It's good for your billing metrics." The smile hardened. "I'm going to pretend I didn't hear that, given everything you've been through lately." He leaned against the desk, establishing dominance through proximity. "Your recent behavior has been concerning to several board members. The intensity of your attention to certain patients, the frequency of your protocol questions, the way you've started challenging established physicians, these are signs of stress, perhaps even signs that you're not emotionally prepared for this role." He'd been calling board members. She understood that now, understood the precise choreography of what he'd been building. Each small humiliation, each restriction, each public moment of dismissal was a brick in a wall designed to isolate her so completely that when he made his final move, there would be no one to challenge him. "I want a transfer," she heard herself say. "Different shift. Different ward. That can be arranged." He stood, straightening his jacket. "Though I'd recommend you take some time. Maybe see someone. The hospital has an excellent employee assistance program, no cost, completely confidential. Consider it." He touched her shoulder, the gesture carefully calibrated to seem supportive while establishing absolute control. "Sometimes we all need a break." She waited until he was gone, until the hallway was empty except for the distant sound of the night nurse station printer. Then she stood up and walked to the supply closet, locked the door behind her, and pressed her forehead against the cool metal of a shelving unit. Her hand shook, not from fear, but from the terrible clarity of what was coming. Marcus would be scheduled for surgery at 7 a.m. tomorrow. Dr. Gabriel had already selected the surgical team, she'd seen the paperwork. Dr. Palmer, an attending with less than 3 years of experience in general surgery, would be primary. The experienced surgical team that normally handled complex abdominal trauma had been reassigned to scheduled procedures across the city. The oversight would be minimal. The monitoring would be standard. And when complications arose, and they would, because that was how these procedures went when they were deliberately compromised, Dr. Gabriel would transfer the patient to his private surgical center, where he could bill for emergency transfer costs, the emergency procedure itself, and at least 2 follow-up surgeries. The math was simple. The cruelty was elegant. The safeguards Sarah might have raised, the questions she might have asked, the concerns she might have escalated, all of them had been preemptively neutralized. She was locked out of the EHR system. She wasn't allowed in the operating room. She'd been reassigned away from the case by a physician who'd already documented her as emotionally unstable. She opened her phone in the darkness of the supply closet. Her hands remained steady as she scrolled through contacts, stopped at one listed only as Dark Thoughts Actual. 2 decades of military discipline meant she knew exactly how long to wait, exactly what words would activate the protocols that had been drilled into her during classification briefing in 2005. But activating that contact meant becoming Master Chief Petty Officer Chen again. It meant admitting that the 3 years of burying that identity had been a failure. It meant sacrificing the fragile new life she'd constructed, the simple work of nursing, the anonymity of night shifts and quiet competence. She closed the phone. At 3 a.m., she sat in the break room reviewing Marcus's surgical schedule one more time through the window of Dr. Gabriel's office. He'd left it open, supremely confident in his authority. 7 a.m. Operating Room 2. Expected duration, 90 minutes. The experimental device would be used during the exploratory phase. Complications, when they occurred, would require immediate transfer to his facility, which had a medical helicopter on standby. Sarah understood the timing perfectly. She understood the machinery of what he'd built. She understood exactly how this would end if she did nothing. Her badge sat on the table in front of her, the plastic cracked along one edge from where she'd twisted it during the elevator confrontation with Dr. Gabriel. Just a nurse. That's all anyone saw. That's all anyone could see. Tomorrow morning, Marcus would walk into an operating room with an attending physician who'd never handled a case like his, with a surgical team that had been deliberately weakened, with a device that was being used for indications beyond its approval. And Sarah Chen, stripped of her access and her authority, would be somewhere else, unable to intervene. The code blue alarm screamed through Cedar Creek Medical at 8:23 a.m., and Sarah ran toward OR 7 before her conscious mind registered the decision, her limp barely slowing her as combat instincts overrode 3 years of civilian conditioning. She burst through the surgical doors to find Dr. Palmer frozen, Marcus's vitals crashing across the monitor like a seismic fault line, his heart in ventricular fibrillation, the inexperienced resident fumbling with defibrillator pads, his hands trembling in a way that told her everything. Dr. Gabriel stood to the side, his phone already pressed to his ear, calling his private facility with practiced regret coating his voice like a second skin. Sarah didn't hesitate. Didn't think. Didn't care about protocol or hierarchy or the fact that she'd been stripped of access to this patient 72 hours ago. Her body moved with muscle memory from 2 decades of battlefield medicine, from extraction fire in Tikrit, from sandstorms and shrapnel and 100 moments when death tried to claim her brothers and she simply refused to let it. She shoved Palmer aside. "Scalpel," she barked, her voice dropping an octave, carrying the weight of absolute authority. When no one moved, when the silence stretched for 2 impossible seconds, she grabbed the combat knife from the emergency kit, the one tool she'd insisted every trauma bay stock, the one piece of her past she'd smuggled into her civilian present like contraband. The blade was carbon steel, worn smooth from her hands, and it cut through Marcus's chest wall with 3 precise incisions that felt like coming home. "Rib spreader." Her hands reached inside his chest cavity, found his heart, cold, flaccid, no longer beating, and began manually massaging it, her fingers finding the rhythm she'd maintained through the worst hours of her life. The rhythm of someone refusing to die. The rhythm of a mother holding her child's heart in her hands and demanding it beat anyway. Epinephrine now, 2 milligrams, push, she commanded, and nurses who'd ignored her for months, who'd called her the night shift nobody and watched Dr. Gabriel dismantle her reputation piece by piece, suddenly scrambled to obey the absolute authority in her voice. Someone handed her the syringe. Marcus's heart stuttered under her fingers, caught, and beat, one weak contraction, then stronger, then finding the rhythm of its own survival. His oxygen saturation climbed. 68. 75. 82. The monitor showed sinus rhythm returning, fragile and uncertain but steady. Sarah maintained perfect pressure and rhythm until the cardiac team arrived, until the machines took over her work, until she could step back and let someone else hold the weight. Dr. Gabriel's face had gone white, then red, then something worse, calculating. He watched her, his eyes moving across her blood-soaked scrubs, her steady hands, her absolute composure, and she saw the moment he understood that his carefully orchestrated sabotage had just failed. That the procedure he designed to generate complications and justify a transfer had instead produced a miraculous save. That Sarah Chen, the disposable night shift nurse, had just performed an emergency thoracotomy with a combat knife in front of a trauma team and his own eyes. But the calculation came faster than the anger. He closed his phone. He straightened his jacket. And Sarah understood, in that moment, that he was going to use this against her. Within an hour, security escorted her to his office, a corner room on the 5th floor with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Denver, everything designed to communicate power and distance. Dr. Gabriel sat behind his massive desk, his fingers steepled, his voice dripping with manufactured concern. Nurse Chen, you performed an unauthorized surgical procedure, violated every protocol in our hospital system, and demonstrated dangerous emotional involvement with a patient. I have no choice but to terminate your employment effective immediately for gross misconduct. He slid the termination papers across the desk, already signed. His signature in black ink. Her crime in permanent documentation. You used hospital equipment for procedures you're not qualified to perform. You endangered a patient. I'll be filing a formal complaint with the Colorado Board of Nursing. He paused. I'll make certain every facility in this state knows exactly why you're unemployable. The words landed like shrapnel, each one calculated to wound. Sarah stood perfectly still, her scrubs still stained with Marcus's blood, dark brown against the pale blue, and signed the papers without a word. She didn't defend herself. Didn't explain the field thoracotomy training that was the foundation of her entire career. Didn't mention the 243 lives she'd saved using this exact procedure in worse conditions than an American hospital. She simply signed. Handed the pen back. Waited while security walked her through the corridors where nurses who'd mocked her watched in silence, their eyes tracking her exit with something that might have been regret or might have been relief that the attention was finally leaving them alone. The pain was information. That's what her instructors had taught her during combat medical training, back when she was young enough to believe pain had meaning. She let the termination sink in, let it catalog itself in her system, professional credibility destroyed, financial stability evaporated, the new identity she'd spent 3 years carefully constructing reduced to ashes in 60 minutes. She walked to her locker and found the metal still scarred from a night shift nobody, still holding the phantom smell of spilled coffee. Inside, her few belongings, a second pair of scrubs, the tarnished military challenge coin she kept hidden in the zipper pocket, the phone number of a VA counselor she'd never called. She gathered these things in silence, aware of the eyes on her, aware of the weight of what she'd done transferred from her own shoulders to everyone else's. Her car sat in the employee lot at the edge of the parking structure where the light never quite reached, grey afternoon rain starting to fall. She sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine, hands gripping the steering wheel at 10 and 2, the way they'd trained her, controlled, precise, ready for anything. Her knuckles went white. The trembling wasn't fear, and it wasn't resignation. It was restraint. It was 20 years of combat discipline compressed into the space between her ribs, refusing to explode, refusing to break, because Master Chief Petty Officers don't cry in parking lots. They sit. They breathe. They catalog the damage and move forward into whatever comes next. But what came next wasn't isolation. What came next was something that would shake the entire hospital to its foundation, though Sarah couldn't know it yet. 2 days after her firing, while she sat in a VA waiting room on the east side of Denver surrounded by veterans in various states of damage, wheelchairs, prosthetics, 1,000-yard stairs that mirrored her own, a military helicopter descended towards Cedar Creek Medical's rooftop at 2:15 p.m., its rotor wash rattling windows throughout the facility with the sound of destiny announcing itself. Sarah's phone buzzed, Marcus, asking to see her again. She ignored it. She was done. She'd done what needed doing. Now it was time to disappear back into the night shift that had nearly consumed her, until a man in a grey suit showed up at the VA hospital and handed her a phone call from an admiral who wanted to know why the most requested combat medic in Special Forces history was working as a nurse in Denver instead of commanding the recognition she'd earned. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. Dr. Gabriel's hands trembled as he scrolled through Sarah's personnel file, the classified header marking it as restricted material he had absolutely no authorization to access. The hospital board member with Dodd connections had been all too happy to help, a favor owed from 5 years ago when Gabriel had steered a lucrative orthopedic contract his way. What Gabriel found in those redacted pages made his chest tighten like a fist closing around his heart. Special Activities Division. Combat Medic Clearance. 20 years of service marked across documents where entire sections were blacked out, the kind of redactions that only appeared when someone had operated in the darkest corners of American foreign policy. He'd been trying to eliminate a night shift nurse. Instead, he'd been trying to eliminate a ghost. The panic didn't show on his face. Gabriel had spent 30 years perfecting the art of composure in crisis. He closed the file and locked his office door, his mind already calculating angles, already searching for the narrative that would protect him when this inevitably unraveled. The problem was that he'd moved too fast, too visibly, too deliberately. The problem was that Sarah Chen wasn't just a nurse he'd humiliated into quitting. She was something far worse. She was someone with institutional memory, classified access, and connections that ran straight up the chain of command. It wasn't a request. It was a command. By the time Marcus Webb regained consciousness on day 3 post-op, Cedar Creek Medical had already begun receiving visitors. Military visitors. Visitors who moved with the particular kind of purpose that made hospital administrators stammer and fumble for policies that clearly didn't apply here. Marcus opened his eyes to find Sarah standing at his bedside, checking his vitals with steady hands while the heart monitor beeped its reassuring rhythm. When his vision focused, when recognition dawned across his face like sunrise, he grabbed her wrist with fingers that had no strength left but all the urgency in the world. Master Chief Chen saved my life in Tikrit. The words fell into the room like a stone into still water, creating ripples that would spread through every corridor of Cedar Creek Medical in the time it took for the morning shift to begin. Within hours, nurses were whispering in supply closets. Residents pulled up military records on their phones during lunch breaks. Someone in administration leaked Sarah's service record to the hospital chaplain, who, overcome with the weight of it, mentioned her commendations to a colleague who mentioned it to 3 others who mentioned it to the entire surgical department. The whispers became murmurs, became conversations that people stopped having when Sarah walked past them. Then the Admiral arrived. He wore his dress blues with the kind of ease that suggested he'd been born in them, his bearing carrying the absolute authority of someone accustomed to being the highest-ranking person in any room. He entered Cedar Creek Medical with a security detail of 4, moving directly to Marcus's room while hospital administrators scrambled to arrange appropriate protocol. The chaplain, sensing the magnitude of the moment, asked to read aloud the citation for Sarah's unit, a unit that had operated in Tikrit in 2007, a unit that had saved a small boy buried in the rubble of a collapsed building, a unit whose service record had been buried deeper than most secrets are buried. The Admiral stood at the foot of Marcus's bed and spoke with the precision of someone reading from memory. 3 bronze stars. 2 purple hearts. Each medal a moment that had nearly killed her. Each one accepted with the same quiet dignity she brought to everything, to night shifts, to humiliation, to the work of keeping people breathing when the world wanted them dead. The list accumulated weight with each name, each citation, each description of actions that had crossed the line from brave into legendary. But it was the man in the grey suit, a visitor who never introduced himself, who wore no insignia, whose very presence suggested he didn't need either, who ended it with a single sentence delivered so quietly that only the Admiral and Marcus heard it clearly. Nightingale. Most requested combat medic in Special Forces history. The silence that followed was so complete that the ventilator wheezed like it was the only thing still alive. The truth, when it arrives at the speed of light through hospital corridors, doesn't announce itself. It simply rewrites everything. Sarah Chen, who had scrubbed her identity clean and rebuilt herself into someone forgettable, was suddenly impossible to forget. The woman who had been called Night Shift Nobody was revealed to be the woman who had saved more lives in classified operations than most surgeons would save in a career. The nurse whom Dr. Gabriel had been systematically dismantling was someone who had stared down insurgents, extracted the dying from rubble, and performed miracles under fire. What they didn't know was that the real destruction had already begun. Jake Martinez, the hospital's IT administrator, was a Marine who'd served 8 years before a knee injury sent him into disability retirement. He'd heard the whispers about Nightingale before anyone else had, because he'd been maintaining the security system when the Admiral's team arrived, and he'd recognized the call sign from a classified brief he'd attended at Camp Lejeune in 2015. Jake knew what it meant. He also knew what it meant that a man like Dr. Gabriel was trying to silence a woman like Sarah Chen. Over 48 hours, while the hospital descended into chaos and the State Medical Board prepared their investigation, Jake copied every security file in the system with the methodical precision of a military intelligence specialist. He pulled security footage of Dr. Gabriel deliberately reassigning the experienced surgical team from Marcus's procedure. He found emails coordinating kickback arrangements with medical device suppliers, a 3-year operation that had generated $3.2 million in fraudulent billing. He located audio recordings of Gabriel coaching board members to dismiss Sarah's concerns about unnecessary procedures. Dr. Gabriel didn't know about Jake until the FBI arrived. The realization came in stages, each one accelerating his spiral. First came the investigators with their quiet questions and their growing certainty. Then came the security footage he'd tried to delete, footage that showed every deliberate choice, every sabotage, every calculation to destroy a patient's care for profit. Then came the moment when his attorney explained that the evidence was overwhelming and that negotiation was no longer possible. The federal prosecutors weren't interested in deals. They were interested in examples. They were interested in sending a message to every corrupt administrator in every hospital in America. Dr. Gabriel's medical license suspension was announced on a Tuesday. His hospital privileges were revoked by Wednesday. The FBI froze his assets on Thursday. By Friday, his wife had filed for divorce with a stack of evidence that suggested she'd been documenting his behavior for years, waiting for someone like Sarah Chen to create an opening. His country club sent a formal letter regretting to inform him that his membership had been terminated. The Colorado Medical Board issued a public statement that would follow his name forever, a permanent mark that would attach itself to every job application, every background check, every attempt to rebuild. 6 months later, Dr. Gabriel stood in front of a classroom of bored community college students in a basement room that smelled like fluorescent lights and desperation. He taught CPR basics to people who weren't listening, his voice flat, his presence invisible, his authority reduced to correcting hand placement on plastic mannequins. $14 an hour. That's what the medical fraud of 3 years and the systematic destruction of a woman's career had earned him. He lived in a 1-bedroom apartment 2 miles from Cedar Creek Medical, close enough to remember what he'd lost, far enough that no one would recognize him. His ex-wife kept the house. His children wouldn't return his calls. His name had become shorthand in Denver medical circles for everything corrupt in modern healthcare, the cautionary tale they whispered about during continuing education sessions. But that wasn't the real punishment. The real punishment was watching Sarah Chen walk back through the doors of Cedar Creek Medical wearing navy dress blues that fit her like they'd been waiting for her all along. The real punishment was seeing her move through those corridors with absolute authority, seeing how people's eyes tracked her, seeing how every gesture communicated a truth that made his humiliation feel like practice, like he'd been rehearsing his own destruction without understanding it. She was there for Marcus's promotion ceremony, and she carried herself with the kind of presence that made the air pressure change when she entered a room. The Admiral presided. Special Forces operators stood at attention. Sarah pinned Major's oak leaves to Marcus's collar with hands steady as surgical lasers, while he wept in the kind of way that only happens when you're saved 3 times and recognize what salvation looks like. The hospital's new CEO, terrified of federal investigations and desperate to repair the institution's reputation, offered Sarah the position of Director of Emergency Medical Services. Offered her authority. Offered her a salary that made the operators whistle. Offered her everything except what she actually wanted. Sarah declined politely, her voice carrying the particular tone of someone who had already decided what came next. "I'm a night shift nurse," she said. "That's all I want to be." She changed back into scrubs in the same locker room where someone had vandalized her uniform, where the scratches that spelled out night shift nobody had been painted over but never entirely erased. The tarnished challenge coin with the worn trident rested in her locker where it had always been, no longer hidden but not displayed either, just present like the truth of who she was. Invisible to most. Essential to all. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most, and Sarah Chen gave everything, every night, in the quiet corridors of Cedar Creek Medical where the real work happened. She reported for the 11 p.m. shift as though the last 3 months hadn't happened, as though she hadn't been fired and reinstated, and offered everything except peace. The other nurses moved around her with a new respect that she barely noticed, because recognition had never been the point. A new surgical resident approached her at the nurses' station, nervous, addressing her as Master Chief until she gently corrected him, "Just Sarah." Jake Martinez nodded from across the room, a fellow veteran who understood that some people served best in shadows. At 3 a.m., a critical patient coded in the ICU, and Sarah moved through the emergency with the kind of precision that only came from having already survived the worst. Her hands moved on their own, muscle memory taking over, her voice calm, her decisions exactly right. Another life saved. Another moment that would never make headlines. As dawn broke over Denver, painting the sky the color of old wounds healing, she sat in her car before driving home, not gripping the steering wheel in desperation but simply resting, complete in the knowledge that she'd found her way back to the only mission that mattered. If you're watching this right now, please like and subscribe. New stories drop every week. Let me know in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know who you really were? What would you have done if you were Sarah?